face the flag of our nation and recognize the principles for which it stands. Department 1 is now in session. The Honorable Mark E. Wyndham, Judge, presiding.
Please be seated, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're back in session in People versus Robert Durst. The defendant is present with Mr. DeGuerin, Mr. Chesnoff, and Mr. Lewis is nearby. I believe we have, he's in the jury, in the office back there, okay? And we have Mr. Lewin and Mr. Henderson, and Mr. Bailey and Miata and Milius all present. We are going to break a little early today, so we need to break at 3:15, 3:20 at the latest. I think that'll work for our... So with that in mind, let's get started. Mr. Lewin, you may call your next witness.
Dr. Stephen Safyer, Your Honor.
Please come stand in the witness stand. Yes, please. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give and the cause now pending before this court to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N, Safyer, S-A-F as in Frank, Y-E-R.
Thank
You can hear me?
Yes, doctor. So, but you will need to pull that mask over your nose. You'll need to speak directly into the microphone to compensate for that. Yeah, that's a good one. I see you have some notes in front of you, and that may be useful to you at some point, but I'd like you to testify without reference to your notes. If you need them, that's fine, and then just let us know that you're looking at the notes. All right?
Good.
You may proceed, Mr. Lewin.
Good morning, Dr. Safyer. Can you tell me, what do you do or what did you do for a living?
Well, my last job was the chief CEO and president of the Montefiore Health System in the Albert Einstein College of Medicine.
And what does that mean when you say you were the CEO? Can you explain what that means?
I was in charge.
and when you say you were in, simple answer, when you say you were in charge, how many hospitals were you in charge of?
So the hospitals joined us in different manners, having to do with difficulties and other things that they had had in the past. But basically 18 hospitals.
And you said you
4
were
counties, New York State.
You said you were also in charge of Albert Einstein College of Medicine.
Correct.
And would that mean that, in essence, when you go past the deans and the presidents, et cetera, that at the very top for Albert Einstein College of Medicine would be you?
Correct.
In the position that you had, approximately how many employees were you in charge of?
So again, it's how you come to that number, but it's 50,000, 55,000.
And you said your last job, when did you retire?
I retired November, not last year, the year before. So right before the pandemic.
And is it fair to say, Dr. Safyer, that the position that you had, you were leading one of the largest healthcare systems, not only in New York, but in the nation?
Correct.
Can you tell me, are you because you have the name doctor before you, are you a physician as well?
I am.
Still
am.
Can you explain your education and training?
Sure. So I graduated from Einstein, and it was 1982. And I was trained there, and I'm an internist, and in addition to that, population health.
And what does that mean? What is population?
It's trying to do the best for every patient with very different backgrounds and very different issues. And as we see in the pandemic, these things are more complicated than sometimes we give, in times that we don't really recognize it. You can have an illness, but if you don't have insurance and you're afraid to show yourself and come to the clinic or whatever you need, which is happening now, that is a very important aspect of it. And it was especially true for our mainstay institutions long-standing because it was in the Bronx of New York.
And Dr. Safyer, in terms of that last position you had when you're supervising 50,000 people, were you actually practicing medicine as well?
I stopped practicing medicine on a regular basis 12 years before that when I became the CEO. And I did miss it, but I was frequently not able to make rounds and teach and see the patients that we were caring for. So it was one or the other.
And am I correct then, if you say you graduated from Einstein College of Medicine in 1982, I assume that, did you start in 1978?
I did.
And can you tell me, from 1978, did you have a continuous relationship with Einstein and Montefiore until you retired?
Oh, yeah.
And can you tell me, in the position that you are in as CEO, do you also have to deal with donors? Oh, you need to answer out loud because the court reporter,
Oh, I'm sorry.
that looked like an exasperated nod.
Certainly.
And with respect to your position at Einstein and as the CEO, are you familiar with the history of Einstein?
Very much so.
And I would assume,
Which is the reason I went there.
and can you briefly explain that, please?
So Albert Einstein, when he came to America, was close with a lot of his friends from Europe. And he was, at some point, had to leave because of the war. And he came to the Northeast eventually and had very good friends at Einstein and Montefiore and got all his care there. So over time, people wanted to build a school that would be associated with Montefiore, which was much older, and that would, and for a very long period of time, they were making it appealing to Einstein, who was, somebody who said, well, I'm not a doctor, so why should you, whatever. Eventually, he agreed to do that. And Montefiore and the people there played a big role in that happening. It turns out when it happened, it was owned and operated by Yeshiva University, and was until about 7 years ago.
And
10 years.
And in the position that you're in, you indicated you were familiar with the donors that were involved, both currently and I assume historically, with Einstein.
Absolutely.
It has been suggested that the Durst family was extremely influential at Einstein to the point of being able to get a student, Kathy Durst, admitted into medical school, potentially absent proper qualification. First of all, can you tell me what your knowledge of, based on your nearly 40-year relationship with Einstein, is with respect to the Durst's influence at that institution?
I know no one that was ever admitted that didn't have the qualifications. That doesn't mean that some people, there's a certain amount of people in a year, but I find that it doesn't touch me as something that I saw happen. people ask you to do things, but you have to be qualified.
And, Doctor, were you aware of the Durst family being in any way major donors at the institution?
They were no different than a lot of other groups, and they did give money. I don't remember exactly how much, and it was before, you know, I was even a student.
And in terms of the numbers, is it fair to say that most wealthy Jewish families in New York have contributed at times to Einstein?
The majority, correct.
Now, you indicated that you started in 1982, and that's the same year as Kathy Durst. Is that somebody that you knew?
I did.
And can you describe, how did you meet Kathy Durst? What were the circumstances?
Well, we were all very close. It's one of the reasons I went there. Felt very much at home. Didn't have a lot of, you know, it didn't have the same, so, you know, you weren't in Manhattan, you were in the Bronx, and it was a place where most of us lived there, you know, because it was easier.
By us, are you referring to your fellow medical students?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Correct.
please continue.
Because you would work very long and tedious hours, and trying to get there by buses and trains and cars and so forth could take too long. So we got to know each other.
Can you
And
tell me, what was Kathy like when you met her?
She was smart. She was totally focused on becoming a physician. She had been in healthcare before, including being a nurse and a dental hygienist, if I remember correctly. She was very excited, like most of us, if not all of us. Unfortunately, in a lot of medical schools, whether it's done purposely or not, I'm not going to comment on it, I don't know, which is people are pitted against each other. It was the opposite at Einstein. You felt at home, people helped each other. There wasn't, you know, as many tests as there are now, and it was more about learning and working with the people that you were coming up with and were older, and trying to get them to not only become good physicians, but to be
Excuse me,
fabulous
narrative
people.
not responsive to a question.
Overall,
I can't-
but at this point, actually, you're describing the community, and the question was, can you tell me what Kathy was like when you met her?
She was a member of the community.
Thank you. So,
I'll ask another question.
rather than have a long narrative, and so actually I'll sustain your objection because it is a bit of a narrative. We'll proceed by question and answer. So listen. I understand that it pertains to it, but listen to the exact question and answer only the question. So you may continue,
Thank you.
Mr. Lipton.
Dr. Saffer, what was Kathy's reputation among her fellow medical students?
So her reputation was in light of what I was saying, which is that people trusted her. And lots of things you do from the beginning on through, you're working with others, and you're teaching each other, even if you're at the same level. So she was a member of that group who really wanted to be the best physician they could be.
And specifically, what was her reputation as a student and as a young medical student, future doctor, among her peer group, among the other members of her class?
It was high.
Kathy had been a nurse previously, you testified. Was she a little bit older and maybe a bit more mature than some of her fellow students?
So it's interesting, there were a lot of older people in the group, including myself.
Did you know anything about Kathy's personal life at that time?
Well, I certainly knew who the Dursts were, and people would say that. Didn't mean a lot to me. What meant a lot to me is what I was talking about. And she was She was one of us.
Did you know that she was married?
I did.
Now, it has been suggested in questioning that Kathy was flunking out of medical school. Was that an observation that you ever saw?
Never heard it.
And did you ever observe anything consistent at all with that assessment?
No, the opposite.
And can you tell me what you mean by that?
She seemed competent and focused on being an excellent physician.
Can you tell me, doctor, what, if anything, did you know about Kathy's husband?
Well, I certainly had heard, as you mentioned earlier, that he was a member of the Durst family. I knew who they were. And I did not know her husband, but I did meet him 3 or 4 times.
And the times that you met him, did you have any extensive conversations with him that you can recall?
I'm gregarious. I like to talk to people. Sometimes I talk a little too long. And it was my goal to befriend him.
And these casual contacts with Mr. Durst, do you remember, did they occur at school or away from campus, or do you remember?
So, this is important. In those days, there were no rules like there eventually became to have people go home and sleep and so forth. In fact, the more you worked, the more you were considered on point and doing the right thing. Obviously, at some point, you get tired.
I just want to stop you at a moment and just expand on that.
Okay.
Back when you were going through medical school and residency, as opposed to today where there are hourly restrictions, I think in most states, 80 hours per week. Is that correct, doctor?
Yes.
And that means that a resident or a medical student, a resident can come up to their attending and say, doctor, I'm coming up on my 80th hour, and medical schools and hospitals can get in trouble for having their residents, their medical students work past that. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in your time, would it ever occur where a medical student or a young resident would say, doctor, I'm coming up on my 80th hour?
Never.
And can you describe what it was like then compared to what it's like now?
I think today, and this may be a prejudice based on the younger people who are going to med school now, are very focused on going home. And the way you learn medicine is by being there.
And let me ask you, was that an idea and an outlook that was specific to you, or are you describing the culture at Einstein as it existed back in
Vast majority.
1982? What, if anything, did you know at that time about any domestic violence between Kathy Durst and her husband, Bob?
I had heard things.
Objected in calling for hearsay.
Let me ask a yes or a no question, Your Honor, and withdraw that.
Okay.
So I'm not asking you, I'm asking you, were you personally aware at that time of any domestic violence between Bob Durst and Kathy Durst?
I had heard it, but I heard it more
Excuse me.
after she
Hearsay.
disappeared.
So, no, that's not hearsay, but,
I'm sorry. I didn't hear.
no, that's I'm talking to lawyers now.
That's my only question on that issue, Your Honor.
Oh, it's the only question that I'm objecting to.
I'm just letting the court know that I do not intend to go into any further detail on that issue at this time.
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening, I was reading.
Oh, I'm
Say it
sorry.
again?
I had that one question regarding this issue at this point in time. I was merely trying to establish what Dr. Safyer knew when he was going to medical school, and I don't intend to ask any further questions specifically about Mr. Durst and domestic violence regarding the witness's knowledge.
All right, I'll strike the answer.
Doctor, I want to ask you, in the early 1980s, late 70s, was it unusual for a medical student to call in sick to a rotation?
Almost never happened.
And in your experience, how sick would a student have to be to call in sick?
Comatose. You would go.
And was that just kind of your outlook, or was that the culture at Einstein?
It's the culture. And it was not unique to Einstein. I'm sorry? It was not unique to Einstein. It was universal.
Doctor, by the time a medical student is in the last few months of their medical training in medical school, were they dependent upon by the services that they were rotating through?
I'm sorry?
So, when a medical student is in their last few months of medical school and they're doing rotations, were they dependent upon by those services where the rotations were taking place to actually be working and providing patient care?
So, in general, at that point, you know what you want to do, and you're looking to go to places like Einstein. If you're going to leave, or you're going to go somewhere else. So you want, and you're honing in, not just on what they're telling you to do, the school, but what you're interested in, your interests.
And
What's
were those-
leading to the next step.
And were those medical students in that level of their training, were they dependent upon by the services that they were reporting to? In other words, were they just kind of showing up and not really having responsibilities, or were they a part of a team with responsibilities?
The vast majority would show up to the very end of their rotations.
And let me ask you, did you ever call in sick to a rotation while you were in medical school?
No.
In your experience, if a medical student were going to be sick, who would they contact with respect to notifying they're on a rotation that they're going to be sick?
So it depends on the, surgery versus internal medicine and so forth. These have somewhat different structures. And people are going in to do surgery that has a certain aspect to it. But to generalize, the question you're asking me is that you would probably call, and obviously some people didn't show up if they were extremely ill. You would call the people who were training to be the position that you were in and talk to one of them. They had graduated and they were now first or second year or third year students going on to be a surgeon or whatever.
So you would call a resident
You'd call a
within the
resident.
rotation you were supposed to show up
Yes.
to. If a medical student was unable to reach a resident, were you directed as medical students, you knew the service that you were reporting to, is that right?
Yes,
And back then, people had those strange things called pagers, right?
correct.
And if you were going to be ill as a medical student, would you have been, had knowledge in advance you're going to be working for this service and had the ability and the requirement to be paging that service to let them know you're not coming?
That would be what you would do.
I want to
Most
ask,
people didn't have people's phone numbers. It wasn't like today, where everybody has everybody's phone number.
we have the numbers, but none of us can actually remember what they are.
That's true too.
In your experience, would it be out of the ordinary for a student to call the dean instead of the rotation itself to report an absence?
So of all the things that I've thought about since then, that always seemed to me to be a signal. There was something wrong with that. And the reason that something wrong was that would be that if something happened to you today, I don't believe that you would call the mayor or somebody in the highest level of California.
Now, you supervised.
This was like a number 2 level.
You supervised actually everybody in the end. Every dean at Einstein eventually reported to you. Is that correct?
Correct.
Have you ever heard in your 40-year career of a medical student calling a dean instead of the rotation that they're going to be showing up to, that they're due to show up to, instead of that rotation to report that they're ill?
I have never heard that.
And, doctor, you indicate you supervise 50,000 people, is that correct? Have you ever had one of your
Speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, correct. I apologize.
You ever had one of your employees call you up, a lower level employee, not the person, the number 2 or the number 3, but somebody who is a little bit down the chain, to inform you that they're going to be sick that day?
Never.
I want you to assume the following hypothetical. So I want you to assume these facts. A 4th-year medical student, a few months away from graduating and becoming a physician, has a rotation in an area of specialty and at a hospital that they are interested in applying to for a residency. On the first day of that rotation, the student calls in sick at the time or after the time that the rotation was due to start. And instead of calling the rotation itself or the department at the hospital where the rotation is taking place, they instead call a dean at the medical school. Do you understand that hypothetical?
I do.
Can you tell me what is your response to that hypothetical?
My response is that she didn't make the phone call.
And if I were to ask you, what is the likelihood of a scenario like that? If I were to say to you on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being, you know what, I can absolutely, I would expect that would happen, and 0 being, I can't see a scenario where that would happen, what would be your response?
0.
And again, in terms of your contemplation, is that a hypothetical that you have to spend a lot of time analyzing to come up with that answer?
No.
I want you to assume that that same medical student from the hypothetical had had some prior academic difficulties that the school was aware of. In your experience, would that make it more or less likely that a medical student would call a dean?
No, it's not who you would call about coming in or not coming in. And that doesn't mean that people didn't get help or still get help if they're having trouble.
In your experience, if a medical student were going to call in one day sick to a rotation, would that be the kind of thing, given your administrative responsibilities, that you would expect would be reported to a dean, a one-day absence for
No.
being sick?
No.
I want to ask you, if a student were supposed to be starting at 9 a.m. for a rotation and were sick, what time would you expect the call to come in saying that they could not be there?
Well, it would matter what the illness was. And I'm not saying that, I just don't have any memory of somebody calling in and so forth. But, I mean, obviously you could have contagious illness, you could have, I mean, things could happen and you could be sick, but you would be calling the people that I mentioned earlier.
Would you be calling them if you had advanced? So I'm not saying someone got hit by a bus or they had a sudden trauma, etc.
Right.
I'm saying someone wakes up feeling sick. They're due to start a rotation at 9 o'clock. What time would you expect a call to be made to that rotation?
Two things. They wouldn't make the phone call to the person they made the phone call to, and 2, they would have done it early, 6 o'clock in the morning.
Let me ask you something. What about the idea of a student calling in sick specifically to the first day of a rotation?
Well, it even makes it more strange. You don't usually call in sick to the first day of a rotation. That's an important rotation towards the end of your time there.
And I want you to assume, which was in the hypothetical, that that student who is calling in all the hypothetical facts that I gave you, and they're calling in on the first day, and they're calling in at or near or after the time the rotation was supposed to start. I want you to assume that that student is interested in pursuing a residency within that program. Can you tell me, does that make the hypothetical more or less likely to have occurred?
So it would make it much less likely, if
Can
not
you explain why, please?
zero, because you would want to go, even if you're not going to Einstein, or one of our hospitals for the training, it's not good for your reputation. And
And-
reputations are built on, how you behave.
And you're familiar with the match, is that correct?
I'm sorry?
The match? Are you familiar
Yes,
with
I
the
am,
match?
I am, the match.
And in the match, medical students request certain specialties at certain hospitals. So let's say I'm in New York, I want to do orthopedics at X hospital. I rank them 1, and then the hospital on the other end is ranking the students, is that right?
Correct.
And so if
It's
even
like a
if...
marriage.
Right. And then if you are hoping to get that residency, even if you list them number 1, if they don't have a good impression of you and they don't list you high on their list, you're likely not to get that residency. Is that correct?
That's correct, and in addition to that, I would add that if you do that, the word could get out, that to others, because people know each other, at other institutions in New York.
Now, you're actually married to a classmate, and in fact, our next witness. Is that correct?
Correct,
That's Dr. Paula Marcus. Is that right?
correct.
And you and Dr. Marcus started dating early on in medical school. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I would assume that given your personal experience from 40 years at Einstein and at Montefiore, as well as what you've observed with your wife, can you tell me, is the situation in terms of the medical community, can you tell me what it was like for women as medical students and doctors in the late 70s and early 80s compared to how it is today?
Okay, that's an interesting question. It wasn't 50-50 in those days. And in most places, perhaps it was 20% women. And I would include most places in New York, which is, like California, pretty progressive on issues like this. But Einstein was much higher, and I don't remember exactly, but I think about 40% were women in our class, 38%.
Was it still back when you were starting medical school? Were women still, fair or not, having to prove themselves to be worthy of being physicians?
Yeah, without a doubt. But it has changed.
There's a famous quote, and I want to know if you can tell me if this would apply to your experience at medical school. Ginger Rogers used to say that she had to do everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in heels. Is that a fair assessment of what it was like for female medical students and residents in the late 70s and early 80s in your experience?
Absolutely.
And can you tell me that in your experience, were the women in your class, were they aware that to some degree they were acting as kind of pioneers for those behind them?
Totally.
And in your experience, doctor, did the women who you went to medical school with, did they, in your experience, make a concerted effort to make sure that they were at least as tough or not tougher than their male counterparts?
So the answer is yes, but just I would add one thing, which is that unfortunately there are divisions of care where it's more rampant. So surgery is something very hard back in those days for women to break that kind of, ability to be equal.
In your experience, would a female medical student calling in with, on the first day of a rotation, allegedly sick with complaints of a headache, cramps, and diarrhea, does that sound like the level of illness that in your experience would have kept a dedicated medical student from the first day of a rotation?
I can't imagine anyone doing that in our cohort, the people that were there, the women that were there.
I want you to assume the following, Doctor. It's another hypothetical. I want you to assume that while Kathy was in medical school, that she was being emotionally and physically abused by her husband. In your opinion, as someone who's ran the entire hospital system and been through residency medical school yourself, do you believe that would likely have an impact on the performance of that student?
It would be hard to overcome, for sure.
Do you know anything about Kathy Durst's drug use?
No.
She has been described by the defense in this case as, quote, a drug addict.
No. You keep saying that. I object. That's not the description.
Sustain. Please raise your question.
She has been described by the defense in this case as a heavy cocaine user, where cocaine was interfering with her ability to do her job as a medical student. Did you ever observe anything remotely similar to that?
No, I never observed it. I've heard it over the years. It comes to the surface, but no.
When you say you've heard it over the years, is that from reports in the media?
Media,
So in other words, you didn't hear it from people who work with her?
no.
How'd you find out about Kathy's disappearance?
Relevant.
Overruled. You may answer.
From other classmates who were, knew about it sooner. I don't remember whether they were in the same program at that time or what it was, but
From fellow students?
yeah, other students.
And did you learn about it at the time you were still in medical school?
Yeah,
And you and Kathy were due to graduate in 1982, is that right?
correct. 3 or 4 months later.
And can you tell me, what was the response at Einstein in terms of, were her fellow classmates surprised, not surprised at her disappearance?
Hearsay.
Sustain. Halted.
Was Kathy's absence noticed by you and your fellow classmates at graduation?
Very much so.
Same question. It's hearsay.
What?
Absence noticed by you and your fellow classmates. Why don't you break it down into 2 different parts? One's going to come in, the other might not. Go
Well,
ahead.
was Kathy's absence noticed by you at graduation?
It was.
And can you describe what you mean by that?
A number of people, not a small number, discussed it with each other or said it, or where is
Hearsay.
she and what's going on.
Overruled. The question didn't call for hearsay, but nevertheless, so overruled.
Was there surprise by you and your fellow classmates that Kathy had disappeared?
Hearsay as to the
Sustain.
reactions.
Was there surprise by you, Doctor, at the fact that Kathy was not present at graduation and disappeared?
Well, without a doubt.
And if I were to ask you, was Kathy excited about becoming a doctor?
Very much so.
Doctor, would the Kathy Durst you know have voluntarily abandoned her life a few months short of becoming a doctor, never to be heard from again?
That calls for
Incomprehensible.
conclusion, opinions, speculation.
It is a lay opinion, I guess.
Well, it's a appropriate lay opinion under the code, Your Honor. He knows her.
Yeah, overruled.
And he answered, but I think it was run over by.
No, well, you may answer, I'm sorry. Answer it again.
Incomprehensible.
Thanks.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Good morning, Dr. Safyer. Am I pronouncing it correctly, Safyer?
No, correct.
I'm Dick DeGuerin, and I represent Bob Durst.
I'm sorry?
I'm Dick DeGuerin, that's
Okay.
my name, and I represent Mr. Durst along with
I know.
my colleagues. You said that someone about to miss a rotation would probably call the head of the rotation or another student. What I want to focus on was your use of the word, and I believe you emphasized it, probably. That was your word, wasn't it?
Well,
Was that your
I don't know
word?
what the probably
Was that your word, sir?
referred
Can
to.
you?
So I'm not going to answer it.
So listen to the question, the question that he
What's the
asked.
question?
Focus on that very specific question and answer only that question. You may repeat your question.
Was that your word that you used? Probably.
That they would have called somebody different than the person that was called?
My question to you, in your answer to Mr. Lewin, did you use the qualifying word probably as to who they would call?
There's no probably about who was supposedly called.
So,
And I think I was clear about that.
so this, what Mr. DeGuerin is doing is focusing very, very specifically on the word you used in your answer. So he's asked you a very specific question, and sure, you'd like to explain it, but I will give Mr. Lewin a chance to have you expand on what it means. That's one mode we can proceed in, and it's an acceptable mode. I'm going to enforce that. So he's asked you if you used the word probably. You may answer.
The probably that I used, the word, referred to who she would have probably called.
Exactly.
The
And
speculation.
it was speculation,
Yeah.
wasn't it? And you used the qualifying word probably, didn't you?
I agree.
That means there's a chance she could have called somebody else, doesn't it?
Well, somebody called somebody else. I
I didn't ask you
doubt
that.
that
There's
she
a
did.
chance that she called somebody else. If you say it's probable that she would have called somebody, then it's possible that she called somebody else, isn't it?
I had never heard of it, and I have never
Didn't
heard
ask whether you heard of it. I'm asking about what you said.
Make that a question, Mr. DeGuerin.
It's not a question.
What was her relationship with Dr. Jean Cook?
I don't know who you're referring to.
You don't know who Dr. Jean Cook was?
No, I don't, or I don't remember. Who is he?
Let me see, defense exhibit number B, please. What's this? Hit number one?
You're going to have one, you'll have one.
Oh,
on your
I'm
screen.
sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It'll take a moment for it to come up.
Yeah, it's okay.
You got it? If you want it on the Alamo, we have the courts exhibit also. This should work.
Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
On the screen is the first page of Defendant's Exhibit B. And if we could focus on the top part, the letterhead and the date, yes.
Yeah.
What's on the screen now, a little bit more clearly, is a handwritten note that begins to Ms. Kathleen A. Durst, dated 9 March 1981, and the letterhead is John L. Cook, M.D., Associate Dean, Assistant Dean for Students.
Yeah, I remember his name. I can't picture him at the moment.
So you do remember him.
I do.
And do you know what Kathy's relationship was with Dr. Cook?
Definitely not.
You gave an interview with, a telephone interview, I believe, with Mr. Lewin and others in December of 2015. Do you recall that interview?
I did,
Yes. It was a telephone interview.
and I interviewed him. I don't remember it.
Do you
Talked to
remember
lots of people.
talking to Mr. Lewin and other members of the
Oh, to him?
prosecution team? Yes, this is Mr. Lewin right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about Cook.
I am talking about Cook, but now my question is, do you remember doing an interview with Mr. Lewin in December of 2015?
I don't remember it, particularly. I have talked to him.
Did you know that your interview with Mr. Lewin was tape recorded without your knowledge?
I don't even remember having that conversation, so I don't know that.
Did you then tell Mr. Lewin she probably called whatever the equivalent of the dean of students was? Did you tell Mr. Lewin that?
I don't remember having that conversation with him, but, she,
May I show the witness the transcript?
Yes. Just to refresh his recollection.
Yes, to refresh his recollection. Read that to yourself, sir, not out loud.
Oh.
There's no question pending.
Okay.
Have you read it?
yeah.
So, did you tell Mr. Lewin? Thank you. Did it fall?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Did you tell Mr. Lewin she probably called whatever the equivalent of the dean of students was?
So what?
Did you say that to Mr. Lewin?
I'm going to ask that at the witness
I'm not yelling.
that he be allowed to answer the question.
Yeah. Let's proceed politely.
My memory, not
Did
of
you,
that.
the question before you, sir,
Well,
is,
I thought you asked the question.
You can wait for a moment. Let him ask.
Yeah.
Mr.
Okay.
DeGuerin will
Yeah.
ask it again.
Cool.
did you tell Mr. Lewin she probably called whatever the equivalent of the dean of students was?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want me to say yes or no?
I want you to say yes or no. That's an answer.
I don't remember what I said. I would say
Who
something
is Steve Lazar?
Okay, please let the witness conclude his answer, and then you may ask your next question. So you may ask your question now.
Who was Steve Lazar?
He was another leader in the school.
Another what?
Leader,
Okay, was he,
like Cooper.
did you suggest that name, Steve Lazar, as someone the equivalent of the dean of students was?
I don't remember having that conversation, so I can't answer it the way you seem to want me to answer it.
All right, well,
But if you ask me about Lazar or Cooperman or, the dean of the whole school, Purpura, I would know where we're going. But All I remember is what, and I wasn't on the phone call when she called Cooperman. I just heard that she had called Cooperman.
Your Honor, the last part, I moved to strike because it's.
Okay, non-responsive. Stricken. Well, it's non-responsive.
None of them would make any sense to me compared to calling the person who was in charge of your rotation.
That is responsive, Your Honor.
Well,
Thanks.
actually, it's volunteered.
It was.
I believe it is still responsive to the
But
question.
I'm sorry. There's no issue pending.
Oh, I just
It's
wasn't
that we're
sure.
having questions. There's no objection,
Oh,
there's no
okay.
motion.
My apologies,
Continue.
Your Honor, I thought he was asking to strike.
I moved to strike any volunteered answer.
All right,
It's not
stricken.
responsive. And
Stricken.
so, let me ask it this way. Do you deny telling Mr. Lewin that she probably would have called whatever the equivalent of the dean of students was?
I have no reason to deny it.
So
I
you do
don't.
not deny it?
So I don't deny it.
You will concede that you have followed this case closely in the media, will you?
It comes and goes. It's been in the media recently, but remarkably, it didn't for a long time. Did I care? Yes. When I saw something in the newspaper,
me, this is
did
not
I read it?
responsive.
Yes.
Okay, just a moment. All right, the last part is responsive. It's ultimately responsive.
Well, regarding following the case closely, did you tell Mr. Lewin, I know the story because I've heard it in so many different narrations, plus obviously I watched the TV series like everybody else in the world. I think she probably called somebody named Steve Lazar. Did you say that?
Put Lazar away for a second.
No. Can you answer the question?
I could have.
So you don't
I
deny
don't
saying
remember
that,
it, no.
right?
I believe I always knew who she called.
That's an opinion, Your Honor. We moved to strike that. That's not responsive to the question.
Stricken.
Steve Lazar looked after the students and the rotation.
Excuse me, Your Honor, would you explain to the witness the rules that he's supposed to be responsive to questions and not just make a speech?
Yeah. So this is not an ordinary conversation. It's not actually even a polite conversation, apparently. But we have special rules where, and the reason we do this is to focus a question, and then the other party will have an opportunity to object to that portion. So in focusing the question, I can focus the evidentiary ruling. That's why it's important not to listen to questions, to answer only the question, not to explain your answer, even though it seems to beg for an explanation. And cry out for an explanation, you still can't explain it. But we'll let the lawyers, though, pay attention and bring out the full meaning later. So respond only to questions, please. Okay?
Just to put this to rest, whatever you know or think you know about the telephone call has come from outside sources. It means what you've heard, correct?
You're asking me about the call that supposedly you're saying that she made.
The call that Dean Cooperman has said she made.
Well, I wasn't there. Yes.
Yes, so the answer is,
Okay,
That's
yes.
an improper statement by Mr. DeGuerin. It assumes facts, not evidence. He's basically testifying.
Okay, right. So
Motion to strike, and please instruct Mr. DeGuerin to not ask questions in that manner, Your Honor. It's obviously objectionable, and he knows it.
I don't believe that's objectionable at all, because we know that Dean Cooperman has testified and will testify
All
that he
right.
received the call.
It's not in evidence yet. The way the question is phrased is a way that adds this argumentative content to it. So I'll sustain the objection to that question for assuming a fact not in evidence. But the point here is to identify a call that is at issue in this trial. So I think there's a different way to go about describing this call that we have been talking about. We're always talking about the same call. I think it's in the record with this witness what call, there's previous testimony about this call. So you may follow up with questions about the call.
Yes,
The
Your
point
Honor.
was whether that your consciousness of this comes from what you've learned from others. That's the gist of the question. So go ahead and ask it again.
So to make it crystal clear, whatever you know or think you know about this call is something you've heard from somebody else, right?
Correct.
You referred to it as someone calling Dean Cooperman. Who was Dean Cooperman?
He was an associate dean. There were a number of them. He was very much available, a very decent, still is, person, and caring. But so was Lazar and the others that I mentioned. They all had, to some extent, when we were there, I had no idea what they did, to tell you the truth. Like, I didn't specifically know what they did, but I'm telling
Judge,
you.
would you make one more effort to
Well,
instruct him to be
Somebody was asking me
responsive
that question.
and not volunteer?
Yes, Mr. DeGuerin. So this is an example of an ordinary discussion, the discussion we have 99% of the time, maybe more. We don't ordinarily have a cross-examination, but cross-examination is different. And
Got it.
so that was interesting, but it's not responsive to a question. So thank you. It's stricken. Go ahead.
So the bottom line is, whatever you know or think you know about the call, you've heard from somebody else, right?
That's correct.
Now, Dean Cooperman was someone who was a dean at the time that you and Kathy were both in school, right?
Correct.
And he was open, available, friendly to the students.
Beloved.
What?
All the things you said in beloved.
And beloved, all right. And you now remember Dr. Jean Cook. It's spelled Jean, and that ordinarily is pronounced Jean, but we know it's pronounced Jean because it's a French pronunciation. And you now know who Jean Cook is, right?
Yes,
Did you have a relationship with Dr. Cook?
I did.
Did he reach out to you if you were in problems, having problems?
No, because I wasn't having problems.
Okay. Was it his position as assistant dean for students to reach out to students who were having problems?
So I don't know the answer to that question
Well,
because it wasn't
let
clear.
me ask it this way then. If you don't know the answer, as CEO later in your career of the whole shooting match, would it be the role of a assistant dean for students to offer a helping hand to someone who is having trouble?
Well, I have no trouble answering that, yes, by the definition of what it is.
Good. Now let's see the rest of that note. Can you read that? This is still on the screen, page 1 of Defendant's Exhibit B. It says, "Dear Mrs. Durst," or Ms. Durst, "I understand from my office that things aren't going too smoothly for you right now. Would you like to talk to me? Do you think I can help? Sincerely, JLC. Did I read it correctly?
You did.
Assuming that Kathy Durst was having some problems in school and it came to the attention of Dr. Cook, the assistant dean for students, then this personal note indicates that Dr. Cook was trying to help her, doesn't it?
Yes.
Notice that the date, I don't think you can see it now, but the date is 9 March 1981.
Excuse me, say it again?
Notice that the date is 9 March 1981.
Okay.
I'm going to show you
Yeah, I can see it.
a document that's page 2 of Exhibit B.
I can see it.
And if we can blow it up so it can be read a little bit easier. What's on the screen now is page 2 of the defendant's Exhibit B. It's a memoranda from John Cook, assistant dean for students, even has what purports to be a handwritten signature, to the registrar. Let me read it. Mrs. Durst has withdrawn from the surgery clerkship at MHMC-NCB. What does that mean? MHMC-NCB.
One is a city, it's the two institutions in this surgery that you would go to, two different places.
Okay, do
NCB
you know
was
what
a
it stands
city
for?
place. City ran it. New York City.
I couldn't hear you.
NCB is a city-built hospital next to Montefiore Health System, Medical Center. It's in the, it's next to where the Montefiore Health System is, I'm sorry. And there are two, and there probably was a residency that went over both of them, but that was a long time ago. It's pretty empty now and non-existent.
Did Mr. Lewin ever show you these documents to assist you in forming your opinion about Kathy's status as a medical student?
No.
All right, well, let's look at this document. It says, it's dated March the 10th. That's the day after the personal note from Dr. Cook to Kathleen Durst. And it says, Ms. Durst has withdrawn from the surgery clerkship for personal reasons effective today. Dr. Peter Wilk informs me that when Ms. Durst has satisfactorily passed the clerkship examination, she will have satisfied the requirements for the clerkship. Did I read it correctly?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah. It's what you said.
Now, to put this together, on the 9th of March, Dr. Cook writes a personal note to Ms. Durst, and on the 10th of March, he informs the registrar that she's going to withdraw from a surgery clerkship. That's what these two documents say, correct?
Yes, that's what it says.
And you've never seen these before.
No, I have not.
When you stated your opinion about how well she was doing in school, you didn't know about this, did you?
Well, this doesn't mean that she wasn't doing well
I didn't
to a
ask you
certain
that.
point.
Your Honor, he's not being responsive.
All right, let me look. I was, my attention was diverted for a moment. Let's see. You didn't feel this. This means when you stated your opinion. You didn't about this. Well, this doesn't mean that she was doing well. No, overruled.
Sorry.
Overruled. That's fine. May stand. Go ahead.
What, in your experience, would be a legitimate reason for missing the first day of a clerkship?
Oh, that you couldn't get out of bed, that you were vomiting, that you were, severely ill. And if you were severely ill, you'd probably go to the hospital.
And what would be a reason for missing numerous classes? Legitimate reason.
Well, it depends on the person and so forth. It's not universal, that's my point.
Let me see, please, Defendant's Exhibit C, first page. This is a student evaluation by Dr. S. Deschbok. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but do you know that doctor? Did you know him?
Don't know him, don't remember him. There'd be a better way to put it.
Did you do a radiology clerkship?
The radiology one?
Did you?
No.
Okay. Let's look at this document. The narrative evaluation. Ms. Durst was unable to attend a large part of the clerkship, mostly due to ill health. So I have suggested to her that she should repeat the entire clerkship at a suitable time. I am also disappointed at her lack of responsibility in not returning the books she borrowed from our library in spite of repeated reminders. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Now, you didn't know about this evaluation, did you?
Nope.
When you told the jury about her good reputation, you didn't know that at least one doctor said she was unable to attend a large part of the clerkship for ill health, did you?
I need some help on how I answer this.
We'll just listen to the question. and
I don't know
answer
who
it.
the person is, so I can't really.
I'm asking you who the person is.
No, I don't know who the doctor is.
No, sir, that's not my question. The question is, when you told this jury that you had a high opinion of her reputation among students, you didn't know about, for instance, this evaluation, that she was unable to attend a large part of the clerkship because of ill health.
So for 4.5.
Did you know about that or not?
Can I
Your answer?
it without you interrupting me?
Your Honor, could you again instruct the witness to respond to the question?
So, you're up. Okay,
I said nothing.
don't need your help, Mr. Lewin, thank you. Mr. DeGuerin, you interrupted the witness, so let's make this a two-way street of civility. So the question is, when you rendered the opinion about her reputation among her students, were you aware of this document from this doctor?
Was I aware of this?
Yeah, were you aware of this when you answered the question earlier about her reputation?
Definitely not.
Okay. Let's take our break. It's 10:30. You may not discuss your testimony with any other witness during this break. Okay? And we're going to come back at 10:45. Don't talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until after you've discussed the case.